Hey guys, Kenna here. Today we're going to be talking about solar energy. So we said we were going to go into each of the individual types of renewable resources that we were going to cover, renewable energy sources. That's going to include our solar, our wind, our hydroelectric, biomass, geothermal, to go ahead and finish out the year. So today we're going to talk about solar, which is probably one of the fastest growing segments of the renewable energy market. All right, so let's jump right in. Essential questions. Number one, what are the two main types of solar energy and how are they different? Number two, how does a passive solar heating system work compared to an active heating system? And number three, what are the advantages and disadvantages of solar energy in terms of both of those two main types of solar? We should probably go ahead and start off by just taking a look at what solar energy is. You mostly know, but let's just make it really clear. So solar energy originates with the thermonuclear fusion reactions that take place in the sun. Now, if you remember back when we were talking about nuclear energy, fusion is the combining of atoms, and fission is the breaking apart of atoms. Nuclear fission is what takes place inside a nuclear reactor, typically breaking down larger molecules like uranium to produce smaller ones. In the heart of a star, however, fusion's taking place, usually fusing things like hydrogen into helium, and then so on and so forth, all the way up until you get to things like iron. Right? Now, that energy from the sun represents the entire electromagnetic radiation spectrum. Okay, so the electromagnetic spectrum, everything from radio waves all the way up to gamma rays and everything in between. So, visible light, infrared, ultraviolet, X rays, all of that is being emitted from the star as it's going through these nuclear reactions. And the radiant energy from the sun has powered life on Earth for millions and millions of years. And that's what we rely upon for all of our energy sources if you could take it back far enough. So this leads to the energy that eventually will produce fossil fuels, as well as the energy that plants use today to go ahead and do photosynthesis. So what are the advantages of solar power? We'll go over these very broadly, and we'll return to these at the end of the presentation. Well, all the chemical and radioactive polluting byproducts of thermonuclear reactions, think about all the nuclear waste that occurs with a nuclear power plant, they remain behind on the sun, while only the pure radiant energy actually reaches our planet. The volume of energy reaching the Earth is incredible. It's huge. By one calculation, 30 days of sunshine striking the Earth have the energy equivalent of a total of all the planet's fossil fuels, both used and unused. That's an incredible amount of energy. And as a result, the actual fuel source is free and clean, as well as unlimited. So if you're thinking about getting solar panels for your home, you're probably wondering whether or not you can receive enough sunlight where you live. You may have also heard that it's not just about the total hours of sunlight, but what they call peak sun or peak sun hours in the particular place where you live that probably matters the most. In the lower right-hand corner here, you see the map of the United States, and it has different colors representing the amount of sunlight that is achieved or reached at each of the different locations. That dark red color in the lower left, the southwestern US, is the most direct sun in terms of peak sun hours. So you heard me correctly, we're talking about peak sun hours, and this is actually a pretty important number because it determines whether the solar panels will really be worth it for you. Peak sun hours are easy way to measure and compare the amount of sunlight between locations. Now, if you go ahead and take a look at a place like Oregon, we're going to have a lot less of these peak sun hours than you would, let's say, in California. So a peak sun hour is defined as 1 hour in which the intensity of solar radiation or sunlight reaches an average of 1,000 watts of energy per square meter, which is roughly about 10.5 feet. Another way to put it, one peak sun hour is equal to 1,000 watts per square meter, excuse me. of sunlight per hour. However, that amount fluctuates depending on the time of day and things like cloud cover. So let's say during the early mornings and late afternoon, sunlight is likely to be less than 500 watts per square meter. Conversely, during ideal conditions, midday on a clear sunny day, you might actually receive more than the 1,000 watts per square meter, say 1,100 or 1,200 even on a really nice area in the US Southwest. So we're just going to use the simple term of peak sun hours. For example, an hour in the morning that receives an average of 500 watts per square meter of sunlight is equal to about zero point 0.5 peak sun hours. An hour at midday that receives an average of 1100 watts per square meter equals 1.1 peak sun hours. Here in Oregon, we receive about 3 to 5 peak sun hours a day versus, say, California, which has about 5 to 7.5, or Arizona at purely optimal, which has about 7 to 8. And so that impacts whether or not a large scale solar installation is going to produce enough energy to be worth its cost for the grid. So if we're talking about these peak sun hours and the limited availability that may exist in particular parts of the country or the world, we have to go ahead and take a look at the disadvantages. Sun is not always there. We have nighttime, right? And so this is not a all the time producing energy source. And it's a diffuse source. And to harness it, we have to concentrate it into an amount and form that we can use, like heat and electricity. Addressed by approaching the problem through how do you collect it? How do you make it as efficient as possible so that you're not losing it and transforming it from one form to another? Remember the second law of thermodynamics. And then three, once you have it, where do you put it? If it goes straight into the grid and gets used, no problem. You don't have to worry about storage. But the whole idea is to try and keep it and save it for when you need it. And we have limited storage solutions, as we've talked about in previous classes, with respect to things like batteries. All right. So there are two main types of solar energy we're going to look at here today. The first is what's called concentrated solar power, or CSP, and this uses the heat from the sun. The other is photovoltaic, which actually uses the light from the sun. Okay. You see a quick little brief explanation of how we typically use these, but let's start out by taking a look at CSP, or concentrated solar power. One of the ways that we can start looking at this is by looking at passive and active solar heating systems. This is becoming increasingly popular. More and more people are starting to look at doing water heating in particular for their homes using these types of solar heating systems. In a passive solar heating system, we're going to absorb and store heat from the sun directly with a well-insulated structure. And so we get that sun in and we keep it in. An active solar heating system, however, captures energy from the sun in heat absorbing fluid, which then gets moved in and through the house. Now, passive and active solar heating systems can heat water in buildings effectively either way. The costs, however, of using direct sunlight to produce high temperature heat and electricity are decreasing as we get more efficient in terms of our processes for absorbing and storing and transferring that energy. A passive solar home heating system, like you see here on the left, are used in buildings that have a good deal of access to sunlight. This requires proper design and alignment of the building to optimize the solar energy capture. The active solar home on the right collects energy from the sun through racks installed on its roof. Now, this is much easier to retrofit into a house that already exists. And so this is what you typically will see more of. Okay? But if you're thinking about the two in terms of long-term efficiency, there are differences. A passive system operates without pumps, without blowers, and without any other mechanical devices, but it does require special building designs in terms of its orientation and structure. On the other hand, active heating systems require pumps, require blowers, and often other mechanical devices to help circulate the working fluid for transportation of the heat. However, it does not require special building design, and so this is why it's easier to add on to an already existing home. If you can plan it out ahead of time, passive systems are much less expensive to construct and to operate, but they require that forethought. They require ample winter sunshine and an unobstructed southern exposure. Active systems, on the other hand, are more expensive both to construct and to operate, but can be installed in almost any location in any type of building. And it's not just in terms of heating that we can go ahead and use our understanding of solar. We can also go ahead and use this to cool buildings more naturally. Most people have limited tolerance for hot weather, but there are ways to cool buildings that rely less on electricity. Technology is currently available. Open a window, right? When it gets cooler outside, that cool air is going to come in. It's going to want to try and create equilibrium with the heat inside your house. So the house is going to drop down in temperature because it's got less air than the outside. Use fans, move the air, help it move the air rather than using air conditioning. Try super insulation. Make your house incredibly well insulated so that when you heat it up or when you cool it down, it maintains that temperature much more effectively. And this really helps if you have high efficiency windows. Put in overhangs or awnings on your windows to help reduce the midday sun getting into the house, but still allowing those early and late day heat to come in. Do light colored roofs so you don't absorb as much heat on the roof. Put in something like a geothermal pump. A lot of our heat pumps actually can be sunk into the ground, and you can use that temperature differential of the ground to go ahead and help maintain more stable temperatures for the heating unit. So, what we've been talking about, most of these things are examples of solar thermal systems, what we call CSP or concentrating solar power. We can use this to collect sunlight to boil water, to produce steam, to generate electricity on a small or a large scale. We can talk about a water heater for our house, or we can go ahead and talk about using some big system to power houses. So some systems use arrays of mirrors to track the sun and focus the energy on a central power tower, if you will. You'll see a picture here in a minute of the Mojave Desert and one of a system in Morocco that do just this. But there are simpler ones too, just like a solar cooker, like you can see here in the bottom right of the screen. These are small scale use of CSP, and you can actually get those little solar ovens easily up to 400 degrees on a nice sunny day. You can use that to go ahead and cook with pretty easily. Okay? But like all systems, there are disadvantages. The net energy is pretty low for one of these systems. And if you have one of the bigger ones that are going to produce a lot of energy, they use a substantial amount of water. Most of them are going to be placed into desert ecosystems, which get pretty heavily disrupted by having the actual installation there. And you need some sort of backup system because it's not always going to be sunny. You're going to get cloudy days, and then what are you going to use to go ahead and produce energy? But the disadvantages are not insurmountable, as there are CSP power plants in places like the Mojave and Morocco. So let's take a look at those. So this is the world's largest solar thermal plant using mirrors and opened in California's Mojave Desert. This 2.2 billion, you heard that right, $1 billion plant has 350,000 mirrors focused on three 40-story towers, and it can produce enough energy to power 140,000 homes. We compare that to the other large one, which is the Nur, oh, I'm going to butcher this name, Ouarzazate, is it Ouarzazate solar complex. It's 580 megawatts power plant located about 10 kilometers northeast of the city of Ouarzazate in Morocco. It is the largest concentrated solar power plant, uh, along with that one from in the Mojave. It actually just passed it. Uh, this one can produce all sorts of electricity, and it aims to develop 5 solar complexes. They're only really the one is fully set up Second is in process. Third, they just approved. So it's in process. They're going to keep going on it. They hope to have most of it finished. Hopefully, the fifth one will be done sometime here very soon. And they're hoping to replace a whole bunch of their energy that their country needs, because right now they rely on 95% of their energy coming from imports. When fully finished, the entire completed project will cover an area of approximately 2,500 hectares or 6,178 acres. So it's a huge footprint. But it's not just CSP systems. The one that you're probably more familiar with is actually photovoltaic. Now, the word photovoltaic, we break it down into parts. Photo is light, if you remember photosynthesis from your biology days. And voltaic comes from the word volt, which means electricity. So photovoltaic cells are those that convert light into electricity. So we're getting solar energy and converting it into electric energy, and this is the world's fastest growing technology. When we look at the design of solar cells, you have your thin wafers of silicon. You can see your thin film here. Sunlight strikes the cells and releases electrons. And as it does so, those electrons are going to move, and those electrons can be put into a moving current, which is going to create the electricity. Now, when you start looking at these wafers of silicon, you can stack a whole bunch together, make a little system, make a full panel, and this has great potential in less developed countries. When we go ahead and start looking at countries that aren't supplied by a major, already existing solar electrical grid, you can start putting these to have houses run by themselves, or cities, or camps, or whatever installation we can look at, because they're much lighter and more mobile than most of our other energy sources. And solar energy can be converted directly into electrical energy using these cells. Um, as I mentioned, this is the world's fastest growing technology for producing electricity. There are large solar cell powered plants operating in Portugal, in Spain, in Germany, South Korea, Southwest US, and China. And between 2008 and 2014, the cost per watt of electricity produced by solar cells in the US, at least, fell by more than 83%, and it's expected to keep falling. Solar cells have great potential for providing electricity in less developed countries, as we mentioned. Nearly 1.3 billion people in the world, almost one in every five, lives in a rural village that's not connected to any electrical grid. And a growing number of these people are now starting to use solar cells to generate electricity. They also use solar cells to power highly effective LED lamps that are replacing the heavily polluting kerosene lamps that were historically used. As these small off-grid systems reach more rural villages, they'll help hundreds of millions of people to lift themselves out of poverty. But like any technology, they're not perfect and have their own share of challenges. The key problems here are the high cost of producing the electricity. It's not the most efficient, it just isn't. And if in order for it to work effectively, it needs to be located in very sunny, mostly desert areas. And the production of the solar cells themselves typically uses fossil fuels to make them. And the solar cells, once produced, contain some toxic materials. So when their lifespan is up, we got to find a way to dispose of that properly. However, the cost of manufacturing and producing the energy should continue to drop. And it very well could, as we improve mass production and develop new designs for the solar cells, these chips. And if we were to provide more support through government subsidies and tax breaks, which is largely what has happened with fossil fuels. If we were to transition those sort of subsidies and tax breaks over towards our renewables, solar in this case, that might make it much more competitive, maybe even cheaper than use of the fossil fuels. So let's finish by reviewing our advantages and disadvantages of different systems. Passive and active solar heating system. Advantages, it does produce a decent amount of net energy. It has very low emissions of CO2 and other air pollutants. It does not have a lot of land disturbance, and its cost is relatively okay. It's moderate. And upkeep, especially if you're going to have a passive solar heating system, upkeep is pretty low. Okay? What are the disadvantages? You have to have access to sun 60% of the time during the daylight. So you need those peak sun hours we were talking about. Blockage of any sunlight by trees, other structures, other buildings, clouds. I mean, my house would be horrible for doing solar because most of the house is blocked by trees. The installation and maintenance costs for active systems are fairly expensive, and there has to be a backup system for cloudy days, okay, because it's not going to be sunny all the time. Then we talked about your solar thermal systems. These are the CSPs that we were talking about. Biggest advantages, there's a lot of potential for growth here. They have zero direct emissions from CO2 and other pollutants, so very, very, very clean. The lower costs with natural gas turbine backup, and natural gas is much easier to turn on and turn off, and you use that for peak load, and you use this whenever is available, is a pretty good pairing. And we see a great potential for job creation, both domestic and abroad, when we start looking at these solar thermal systems. Again, you can't get away from the trade-offs of the disadvantages. It does have a fairly low net energy, and the initial costs are pretty high. Okay? There is always going to be that need for backup or storage system for cloudy days. And it typically uses a fair amount of water. And as water becomes more scarce, as climate change continues, this is potentially an issue. And if placed in these sensitive desert ecosystems, which have such limited amount of organisms that are able to survive in those conditions, it can really disrupt them. And lastly, we talked about photovoltaic and the solar cells. What are the advantages? Medium net energy again. Little to no direct emissions of CO2 and other pollutants. It's very easy to install, to transport, and expand as needed, and becoming more and more cost competitive as we develop newer and newer cells. But again, disadvantages. Have to have sun. That's the big one for solar, because you think about, especially in the place like, what if you go up to Alaska in the winter? You don't have sun for full days. That's a long time to go without an energy source. You have to have some sort of backup. You just have to, whether that's another renewable or whether that's a fossil fuel. There are high costs for older systems, so investing in it now may not be efficient in the long term as cheaper systems come online that are easier to maintain. And lastly, solar power plants can disrupt desert ecosystems, just like we saw before, because they take space. Not every solar panel is going to be on the roof of a building or a house. And if we're looking at making a whole bunch of energy, like you saw in the one in Morocco and the Mojave Desert, these are big systems that take up a lot of space to produce adequate amounts of energy. Okay, guys, that's what I've got for you. Stay healthy, stay safe, and I'll see you soon. Take care. Bye bye.